Afternoon and good evening to our international BU alumni and guests joining us from around the globe. My name is Sheldon Simon, and I am pleased to welcome you to this panel with two esteemed leaders from the BU ecosystem. Sandra Galea, Dean and Robert A. Knox Professor at the School of Public Health, and Adil Najan, Dean of the Frederick S. Pardee School of Global Studies, who will speak with us today about climate change. And I'll add that these two schools within our university are beacons of morality within our university. While I am not a BU alumnus, I happen to be the spouse of University trustee Ruth Mormon, who received her bachelor's from BU, also a parent of a BU Academy graduate. BU Academy is a high school on the BU campus. I also serve on BU School of Public Health Dean's Advisory Board, and I chair the advisory board for BU's Institute of Sustainable Energy, which is connected to my work where I'm a partner at Attis Capital specializing in energy infrastructure. I'm really excited to host this panel on climate change. The timing couldn't be better. It is such a pivotal moment for the United States and for all of us around the globe. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce Dean Galea and Dean Najan. Dr. Sandra Galea is the Dean and Robert A. Knox Professor at the BU School of Public Health. Dean Galea sees it as a mission of public health to change the conversation on health and improve the lives of all. Dean Galea is a physician who practiced medicine in rural and remote parts of the world and has received degrees from the University of Toronto, Harvard, and Columbia University. He has written over 900 peer-reviewed journal articles and has published 18 books and is currently the chair of the board of the Association of Schools and Programs of Public Health. Dr. Adil Najan is the inaugural dean of the Frederick S. Pardee School of Global Studies. He is also a professor of international relations and of earth and environment. Dean Najan served as vice chancellor of the Lahore University of Management Sciences in Lahore, Pakistan, and as the director of the Boston University Pardee Center for the Study of the Longer Range Future, a position he currently holds, with the center officially becoming part of the school. His research focuses on issues of global public policy, especially those related to global climate change, South Asia, Muslim countries, environment and development, and human development. Dean Najan has written over 100 scholarly papers and book chapters and was a co-author for the third and fourth assessments of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, work for which the scientific panel was awarded the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize for advancing the public understanding of climate change science. So without further ado, Dean Galea and Dean Najan.
Well, thank you very much, Sheldon, for that warm and introduction. Thank you to the team who made this happen, particularly Jackie Bowes and Omer Zial. And thank you to everybody for joining us for this conversation. I've been looking forward to this because I really tremendously enjoy being in conversations with Dean Najan about all topics, and particularly something around which he is so expert in. So just to frame our comments very quickly, we have, as a world, been having more and more attention paid to the issue of climate change. You heard from Sheldon about the work of the IPCC, which Adil was a part of, and it really felt like the world was moving in a direction of embracing the realities of human-made climate warming, and with a number of accords and treaties in place to try to address that. And then, of course, the world seemed to go through an abrupt phase shift 4 years ago with the American election in many other countries, actually, that were in some respects a reaction to that, and with a lot of noise around rethinking whether or not we want to be parts of those accords. And now we are talking a week after a federal election in the US, which seems to be undoing the intentions of the what was the Trump administration in the US, and now with the potential with the Biden administration having the US rejoin the Paris Accord, for example, around climate change. So it's been a tumultuous period. It's been a tumultuous period in climate change, and all of that is overlaid on this extraordinary burgeoning social movement, particularly by young people, particularly by Gen Z people. Really, I think it's fair to call the climate movement as the first large social movements led by members of Gen Z, and with, of course, Greta Thunberg emerging as sort of a key spokesperson there, but with young people from all over the globe, which shows, I think, how deeply felt the issue of climate change is for Gen Z. And as someone who's the father of two Gen Z kids, I feel that comes from a very honest place, as the young people in Generation Z feel like they are inheriting the world, and they recognize that climate change is a real and present danger to the world that they shall inherit. So I feel like we are at this moment in time when there are political forces that have been going back and forth and swaying back and forth in our commitment to and interest in issues of climate change, overlaid on the social movements driven by young people around the world, and now exiting 2020, entering 2021 in this somewhat uncertain phase in a world that's been whose whole attention has been galvanized by COVID, really paying attention to little else, and potentially a new political realignment, which may have implications for global accords around climate, which may have implications for decades to come. So I feel like I wanted to just frame and bring us to this, what I feel is a fairly unsettled moment in the world's history, particularly unsettled around climate change. So maybe I'll pause there, and Adil, I'll now turn it over to you to maybe for your framing, and then we can go back and forth with your thoughts and my thoughts. Over to you.
Thank you, Sandro. Thank you very much, and thank you for this conversation. I always, I not only enjoy my conversations with you, I think it is important for climate to have these conversations, not just with you, but with I now see over 125 people, are alumni across the globe, across fields. And that, I think, is my central sort of understanding of this moment. In some ways, the only thing I would add to your framing is climate has now become too big and too important to be left to climate scientists alone. And I say that both in humility, but in openness of saying the problem, because we haven't done enough, the problem has actually morphed into something else. It has morphed into something that can no longer be managed by managing carbon. And I'll come to this in just one moment. My key sort of framing of this is what I call the age of adaptation, this realization, which I think some of us are still denying, that we already live today, now, in the age of adaptation. That we lie to ourselves, even if it's comforting, when we try to talk as if climate is a future issue. Right? And that is how we started, because it was a future issue, right? And there was an assumption that we are a half-smart species, and therefore, before things become really bad, we would have done something about it. And climate change was something to be avoided, rather than something to live with. And it is still something to be avoided, because the more we live with it, the bigger it will become. But the reality of today is that climate change is here, it is here now. And in some ways is knocking at our door and saying, guys, do something now, because this will only keep becoming bigger. Right? That's for those who I'm sure all of our viewers understand this, but there are two key concepts: mitigation and adaptation. Right? Mitigation is, there's a problem, let me do something about it before it raises its head. I will mitigate it. I will stop it from happening. Right? And that was the climate debate when I first started, and when most of people of my age started looking at it, which was, okay, guys, this could happen. This could happen in 2040, 2050, 2070. So let's reduce our carbon. Right? And mitigation essentially was carbon management. Because, how does climate change happen? Carbon accumulates. If you manage carbon, you can manage it. How do you manage carbon? You manage energy. Adaptation is essentially problem happens, and you do something about it. because you have to live with it. We have all had a crash course, are having a crash course with COVID on what adaptation means, right? Adaptation means that mask. Adaptation means that social distancing. Adaptation means that it is a little chilly outside, I wear a sweater. We do adaptation all the time, but adaptation is always uncomfortable. It makes you do something that you would rather not do. I would rather not wear a mask if there was no pandemic, right? Climate is kind of the same. In some ways, what the age of adaptation says is that if we do not mitigate enough and mitigate in time, we will have to adapt increasingly, and that is going to have a cost. So we will get into these things, but the age of adaptation is important because in the age of adaptation, the nature of the problem morphs, not only from carbon management, which still remains a great big challenge, but also into managing those impacts. And those impacts are about development. They are about the economy. They are about health. They're about vector-borne disease, right? And that is why that widening of the circle is so important. If you allow me one sentence, I'll come to the others later, but one is important. You started with the last week. So the 4th of November was important. While all of us were still waiting for the results, one result came in on the 4th. And that is that on the 4th of November, the United States of America officially walked out of the Paris Agreement. Right? Mr. Trump had done that at the beginning of his term, but there's a rule about 3 years and so on and so forth. So that was the day the US actually left. As of now, it is no longer a part of the Paris Agreement. I assume, expect the 20th of January, you will hear amongst the first things Mr. Biden says as president that the US is going to get back into Paris. The question for all of us, in fact, is partly, will that make a difference? Because whether Paris makes a difference or not is not going to happen by whether the US is officially in or out. It's going to make a difference by what you and I actually do about these things. So let me stop there, but leave with us this idea that I hope we can talk more about, that in the age of adaptation, the problem has expanded and the nature of solutions we need to think of also need to expand.
So let's take solutions. I mean, we have a number of questions that people submitted as pre-questions, and everybody's welcome to submit live questions in the Q&A. But and Adil and I will sort of toss them back and forth to each other. But Adil, maybe I'll build on the last thing you said about adaptation, and let's think a little bit about adaptation at the individual level as well as the national levels. So a number of people sort of have asked, what is it that we can do as individuals in the context of adaptation, context of climate change? And other people have asked questions about, well, what should we be doing nationally? And I think there's a general assumption, and Biden has said that the US will rejoin the Paris Accord. But I suppose the question that makes anybody who's thinking about this ask is, well, are we going to go back and forth? Are we joining the Paris Accord and we'll unjoin the Paris Accord? Then we join, then we unjoin. What is that doing to us? So what should we be doing individually and collectively to accelerate this process of adaptation?
So in many ways, we are adapting, right? Because adaptation is in some ways very empowering, because it immediately does bring that what can I do question, right? And if you think about the type of things that in the climate debate have worked or have motivated your kids and mine, is that we were able to define things they could do. You know, that thing could be, I will change my light bulb, right? I've done my bit. I will get a hybrid car. I can contribute something. I will turn off a light. And that was not inconsequential, right? I think in some ways, from a policy perspective, one of the big changes that happened was that we started in about 15 years ago talking about climate as individual actions rather than just government policy. Because before that, it was emission policy and development policy and coal power plants and so on and so forth only. And while that is very, very important, it didn't give me the agency to do something. We will be having to make a similar shift with adaptation. But let me suggest that there's a danger in adaptation. The danger in adaptation is that you and I can adapt quite well, right? Because you and I are affluent. You and I have options. And one of the challenges with the age of adaptation is that it becomes more and more difficult to really think of it as a global issue. Because when the fire happens in Australia, when the heat happens in Karachi, when the floods happen in Bangladesh, the the impact is local, right? And if something is happening in Boston, my individual action is, what will I do in Boston? Can I build my buildings differently? Can I get better windows? Right? And so the danger is that the age of adaptation can turn our selfish gene into a much more hyperactive one, because adaptation will happen differently. A better example of this, though it is not related to climate, is earthquakes, right? When earthquakes happen, no one ever dies of an earthquake. No one ever dies of an earthquake. People die because the ceiling falls on their head. And the fact of the matter is that the roof chooses to fall on certain heads more than other heads. Not because those heads of the poor people are somehow sort of more a target of earthquakes. It's because they have weaker roofs, and climate is the same, right? And we are seeing this. We are seeing this in the pictures now. I mean, just imagine the pictures that we have seen in the last year, and pick any year. If allow me a minute, right? So this notion that climate is here now. Let me give you an example. This we are now in November, but we are early enough that the October numbers haven't yet come in, but the September numbers have. So the September we just finished, warmest September ever in recorded history. Okay, you say aberration? Not really. August, the one right before September, second warmest ever. July, second warmest ever. May, warmest ever, though tight. April, warmest ever. March, second warmest ever. February, second warmest ever. January, warmest ever. I can go on, right? And so what happens is that sort of this thing just drips, and we see the evidence happening around us. And what were we doing with these warm temperatures? The same that when you have California fires, when you have fires in Australia, when you have a heat wave in Mumbai, when you have massive rains, or sort of this heat thing, that the heat sort of this fireball of months that happened in South America in the last month, you immediately go inwards and say, I'll solve it for myself, right? So that is where the limitations of Paris, I think, come out. That in some ways, we are still thinking in terms of policy as international countries coming together and signing a piece of paper, and the problem has moved on to that individual action, which I do worry sometimes can make us more selfish. One last line, and I'll stop with that. It is not without opportunities either, right? There are opportunities in crisis, and this one also has some significant ones for development. But first, we have to recognize the moment.
So I'm really taken by your distinction between adaptation and mitigation. I mean, which is a very standard sort of set of arguments right now in climate change. But the notion that you're making that adaptation fundamentally is going to result in climate haves and climate have-nots, and that I liked your notion of the earthquake. So in my writing, when I've written quite a bit about disasters, natural disasters, and I've often tried to push this idea that there's no such thing as a disaster. And because I think disaster gives us a sense of sort of an act of God that strikes equally. What there are stressors, there are whatever you want to call them. There are natural events that happen. What causes a disaster is how we humans then respond to it. And earthquakes is a very good example of that. I often use the comparison of the Great Homs earthquake in Iran, which killed 40,000 people, roughly the same time earthquake in Osaka, Japan, that killed 4 people. And they were roughly comparable size earthquakes, which of course, that meant that the stressor of the earthquake was just one factor. What really killed people was the construction of houses. And the construction of houses then tends to mirror the socioeconomic patterning that you're describing. And you're describing it as well in the context of climate change. Now, I think this is a really important issue today that I keep looking for silver linings, from COVID times. It's always very hard to think silver lining from a global pandemic, but surely one of them should be that we stop thinking in a way that does not account for equity, does not account for intergroup differences patterned by socioeconomic conditions, and in many countries by race and ethnicity. And it seems to me like that needs to enter the climate agenda in a much bigger way than it has been in the climate agenda. What are your thoughts on that? I'm curious.
Oh, I think you're exactly right. This notion of climate justice, which kind of we began talking about in the 1980s. And then unfortunately it went down. And the way we talked about it in the 1980s was again very much related to public health. There were these bunch of papers that started suggesting that if you take a map of the United States, let me just go to that and come to your question in a minute. If you take a map of the United States, and on that map, you put a pin at every place that has a hazardous waste dump, you have just constructed a map of the poorest, most marginalized communities in the United States. Right? That there is not a coincidence that you can do one of these maps and it'll immediately turn into the others. You take a map of the world right now, and you look at the impacts, not just the climate event, but the impact of those climate events. And very often you start the similar thing happening. So I think the return to a greater focus on climate justice, and I would say global climate justice, because that's where the nature of climate is different, right? My molecule, I travel to Canada, I need a passport. The carbon molecule from my car doesn't. Right? And therefore there is sort of this very serious conundrum here that impact does not correlate either to luck or to causation. But the point you're making with COVID, I think, is particularly important. I remember that you particularly at one of our dean's meetings, I'm thinking way back late March or very early April, and School of Public Health on its website had started talking about sort of the inequity with COVID. And if anyone can remember thinking that far back, at that point, the television narrative was, here's a pathogen that treats everyone equally, right? And I remember you in particular, and I remember your school sort of events and stuff saying, no, that really is not how it happens. The pathogen may not care, but we have constructed structures of systemic inequity and injustice that put some people at greater peril than others. And I think that exact same thing is true for climate, right? The silver lining is, I think that the moment forces us to confront this inequity. And in confronting it, we can open new possibilities, because if you remove an inequity, a lot of other good things happen. Right, you unleash the power of societies. The other I think silver lining, if you might, is, and I'm not sure if this is a silver lining because inside that is a very dark crowd. In some ways, I and many others hope that the moment of COVID reminds us of just how much greater these natural forces are than us,
right?
Than whatever arrogance we have of our mighty capacity, right? Dwarfs when something like this pathogen that's not even a fully living creature, you can't see, you can't touch, you can't, and yet it's the most global image right now. But the question with the reminder for climate change is, okay, you get a pathogen and then you cross your fingers and hope that the Pfizer vaccine works. Climate is not going to be dealt with a vaccine. Right? Climate is the type of issue that is going to be more difficult to roll back. Right? And so if there is something to look at, I think it is this learning moment that just like we knew that pandemics happen, we just in our arrogance chose to delay them, thinking we will adapt or deal with them when they happen. Let us not do that with climate change. And in there lies the opportunity.
Interesting you use the word in our arrogance. I've been in a time of COVID. I think I've always felt strongly the the centrality of humility in science and how important it is, I think, for us to, in what we do, to have the humility to realize that we know less than we think we know, and that we need to have the humility and open mind to learn from events. And I feel like this moment has really reinforced that. So I'm actually taken by your notion that we have an arrogance of certitude of approaches, when in fact we need to have the humility of an openness to ideas as they evolve. The maybe we should take some questions from the Q&A. Adil, why don't you choose a question directed to you or to me, however you prefer.
Let me read that. But can I, while we do that, can I throw a question at you?
Sure.
Because one of those common things is really that I do think that the world of public health is not just beginning to, but is starting to come to the forefront of the climate debate.
Mm-hmm.
As we realize that the immediate impacts, a lot of them are going to be about health. How do you see the world of public health reacting to this question, which my world had sort of restricted to a carbon management question?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and it is a rethinking of the scope and remit of public health that which is relatively recent. And relatively recent, I mean, it's in the past decade. When one thinks about what public health, how public health used to be thought of, it was the various core functions of public health, which is sort of disease surveillance and intervening to stop epidemics. But in the past decade plus, there has been a growing movement, which has gone by many different names. There's been the term public health 3.0 used, but to recognize that the scope of public health is far greater than that, that fundamentally you cannot have health without having the structures that generate health. In much the same way as you mentioned earlier, that in March I wrote and others wrote in public health that saying the virus doesn't discriminate is correct, but it's only partially correct, because the consequences of the virus are going to be discriminatory, because the consequences of the virus reflect the intersection of the virus with the world around us. Similarly, the consequences of earthquakes are the intersection between the earth shaking and the buildings we build. Similarly, the consequences of climate change are an intersection with the changing climate, with the structures within which we live. And I think public health came to see that if that's the case, then really we have no choice but to engage with issues like climate change in the context of health. So in 2008, which now I guess is 12 years ago, I published a book which was called Macrosocial Determinants of Population Health. It's a bit of a sort of a technical term. And in it, I had asked a climate expert to write a chapter about climate change in that book. And that was at the time unusual. It was at the time unusual. It was unusual to sort of think of climate change like within a book that was about health. Now it's not unusual at all. Now it's actually sort of lingua franca that climate change is an important driver of health. And I think it's the same. Climate change is seen in the same spaces with what I call macro-social drivers, which is drivers that are larger than us. As one thinks of the functioning of the economy, one thinks about political systems, one thinks about power structures, one thinks about norms around gender equity. These are all large-scale forces that create the structures that generate health. And I think public health is squarely in there, that one understands that there is no health without these structures. Now, COVID, if we talk about COVID for just a second, is of course the perfect illustration of this, because COVID is a virus, yes, right? That's the pathogen. But the national maladaptation to COVID, to use that term, comes not because of the virus. It comes because of a combination of leadership, our public health infrastructure, and our underlying health conditions. That's what ultimately brought us to the place where we're at with COVID. That the virus, the same virus, and if we had different leadership, different public health infrastructure, different set of health conditions, would have had very different set of conditions that emerged from COVID in this country. So we cannot keep thinking about the isolated pathogen or the isolated carbon molecule. We have to think about the structures that surround the pathogen and the surrounding structure around the carbon molecule. There's good news and bad news to that. The good news is, I think it's a more accurate way of seeing the world, and it can point the way to actual solutions that make a difference. The bad news is that the scope becomes much larger, because in some respects, it's easier to say, we just need the vaccine, or we just need the way to mitigate more carbon molecules. And if one thinks that way, one goes down a certain path. If one thinks another way, one goes down a different path. And I would argue that an approach that has been intended to reduce the problem to its constituent pathogen has been unsuccessful, which means we have to have the courage to take the broader path. I'll tell you one analogy that I use sometimes. Cardiovascular disease is the biggest cause of death in the United States. Just when you look at death certificates, more people have cardiovascular disease than anything else. Fact A. Fact B, we know that having poor education predisposes you to more cardiovascular disease later in life. Now, those two are facts. They're pretty undisputed. Now, if you only focus on the first fact, you might say as a country, let's invest all our money in creating a premier research institute that deals with cardiovascular disease called the National Heart, Lung, Blood Institute, and spend billions of dollars every year studying cardiovascular disease. There's nothing wrong with that. If you think the second fact is more important, you might invest all your money in a national institute for education and health. Let's understand why poor education results in health, and let's understand what we might do about it. Now, we as a country have done the former. We have a National Health, Lung, Blood Institute. We have largely ignored the second, even though we know it's also the case. So our lens really matters. It really matters for resource allocation. And I think our lens on climate change is exactly the same. If our lens is the carbon molecule, and really it's about focusing on the carbon molecule, we're going to invest all our money in mitigating the carbon molecule. If our lens is, yes, there's a carbon molecule, and that intersects with the structures around us, then our investment becomes quite different. So I do think that these perspectives, and I'm really glad you brought them up, that they're not simply of academic concern. They're not just two deans being sort of academic boffins going back and forth with ideas to each other, but they do matter for what we as society spend our money on.
If I can build on that, and also some of the questions, there's a bunch of questions here about science deniers, if you will, or climate deniers, right? Michael Goldstein has, and others do. But I want to build on what you said in maybe responding to that. What you said about arrogance and humility. I very firmly believe that. I often say that there is a race between human knowledge and human wisdom. There is no dearth of knowledge. I think that's true in public health too. But we have the knowledge to solve the great problems. What we don't necessarily demonstrate is the wisdom to be able to do so in time, and that's because of arrogance. So there's a lot of climate, who we call climate deniers. And they're otherwise wonderful people. I have a wonderful neighbor, and I think he half jokes. Every time it snows in Boston, he kind of, if he sees me, he smirks and he says, "So where's your global warming now?" And I say, "It's coming, it's on its way, don't you worry, it'll be here." But the point I want to make is, I don't think it's simply denial of science. I think there is a certain arrogance that we will lick the problem when the problem comes. Right? And again, going to health, this notion of health is that I find interesting, that health is, you deal with health when the problem happens, as opposed to trying to prevent it from happening in the first place. There is this amazing parallel in that world where the fancy stuff happens after the problem comes, because we are so smart, we are so arrogant about it, that we will create the cure, we will create the vaccine, as opposed to those other ends of can we think about these policies in a way that the problem doesn't arise. The difference in climate is because it is non-reversible, because now we are messing with a system that is truly global. And that's where sort of, if we remain arrogant, and that arrogance says, not just that I don't believe the science, that arrogance says, that's okay, when it happens, we are smart enough, we are rich enough, we are powerful enough that we will deal with it. and you don't mess with nature, because nature keeps telling you, please don't mess with me. The one other thing that a bunch of people have asked, that I thought is important, Ryan Gallo does and others do, especially because we talked about the Paris Agreement, is Ryan mentions that the problem is not just whether we go into Paris or not, what will China do? And China is so big and so polluting right now, emissions are so great that that will overwhelm whatever we do, right? And then there's a bunch of questions around this sort of international responsibility. Here is the interesting thing. I wrote some years ago this article, which was the short piece. It was titled "Bend It Like Beijing," which is bend the curve of carbon like Beijing is bending it. In many ways, I think the world will be either doomed or saved by China and by India, not because they're good or bad actors, just because there's a billion people in each of them, right? I mean, the math just works that way. And the thing is, I think in many ways we can even learn from China. There are many things we should never not learn, but one of them is that they have a certain practicalness to their policy on this stuff. So they've already announced that they're going to go zero carbon. And not just because of climate, just because they realize that energy is expensive. The questions that were asked here by Sarah and others about renewable, these two get connected. China is essentially an energy poor country. When they see renewable, they just don't see a solution to climate change. They see energy independence. And that is where the opportunity in the age of adaptation comes. The things we can do to adapt, if we do them right, nearly always have development benefits. Right? So how do you adapt? How do you adapt, right? You adapt, for example, by making agriculture less wasteful in terms of water and chemicals. If you are able to do that, you increase productivity anyhow. How do you adapt? You adapt by making your homes better planned and better designed. Right? That has collateral benefits. So in some ways, I think I raise this with the China question because yes, we need to push the big countries, the Chinas and the Indias, but let us also look at what they're doing. I mean, there's a reason why India is investing so much into wind. There is a reason why China is saying middle of this century, we are going to aim for the whole country being at net zero. Right? And that reason is not simply because of climate, I hope it is, but that reason is the type of thinking we need to put. Our goal is not hydrocarbon, our goal is energy. Right? One short story, I know I talked too much, but allow me this one. Years ago, Abu Dhabi of all places, chose to become the home of the International Renewable Energy Association. I was a part of a UN team that was going there to see if this could work. And I was having dinner with this gentleman who supposedly was of the royal family, a prince and whatever, very articulate. And as we had dinner, I asked him, why are you interested in renewables? Like, you're one of the most oil-rich place, even in the Middle East. You stamp the ground and oil comes out. Why are you interested in oil and in renewables? And he said, because we like being rich. And whoever controls energy will be rich. It's not a question of oil or not, right? So I know I'm babbling all over the place, but the point I'm saying is the opportunity will come by thinking of energy not as good guys and bad guys, but by thinking of energy as a human need, because there is a climate justice part to energy, right? There is energy overusers like myself. But there is about a third of the world, possibly more, who have far less energy than they should. They should be using more energy, right? Because energy is a component of well-being. The question is, can we construct a world where their energy will come not from the sources that made the world polluting, but from the type of cleaner sources that we now have at our command?
When you say that, Adil, my question is, maybe we are not very good as humans, and maybe we in the academy are not very good at helping advanced thinking about what our ultimate end is. I feel like, and this has really come to my mind a lot during COVID times. Like we keep being confused about what we're trying to achieve. And I would argue that what we're trying to achieve are the circumstances and conditions in which anybody can flourish and thrive. The creating of opportunities where we prevent bad stuff, and I'm using the term bad stuff intentionally, and we make sure that we prevent bad stuff equitably. I think at the heart of public health are these two principles, prevention and equity. So in climate, I think it's the same thing, but ultimately we want to prevent climate change, make sure that we do that equitably. But the end is not the climate itself. The end is really the opportunity for us as human beings to live a richly realized life, and for you to choose to do with your life whatever you wish, for me to choose to do with my life whatever I wish. And I sort of feel like I like the gentleman from Abu Dhabi's comment that it seemed like he had clarity about his end, and he was willing to be sort of unorthodox about his means if that's what it took to get to his end. And I wonder, I've been thinking a lot about this lately in public health as we have gone to thinking around what approach do we take around COVID, that the mitigating, to use that term, COVID is a means, not the end. The end really is the opportunity for everybody to go on and live their life. And I wonder how that would change the climate conversation if we're clearer about the means and the ends.
So here's what I'm going to plagiarize. I'm going to plagiarize this idea that you threw just now, that the goal is really about equity and about prevention. Right. And because the reason I'm going to plagiarize it is, as you were saying that, I was thinking of climate and thinking, okay, do we really have a third goal in that? And I don't know if we do. It really is those two goals. And I think, unfortunately, you are right. We, especially in academia, but even in our professions, are not good at that. Right? Mm-hmm. It is. I don't know how it is in your world, but in the climate world, it's very difficult to get people excited about prevention. Mm-hmm. Right? No one gives you a brownie point for the problem that didn't happen.
Mm-hmm. No, that's correct. But it's totally true in our world of health. Sorry, I cut you off. Go ahead.
Yeah. So and it's the same. And again, I think what we are finding with the pandemic and what we are certainly know about climate is that these are the type of problems that if you let them happen, they are too big to do something about at that point. But I do want, because there's a slew of questions, and I love it looking at this list of how many people are asking, what can we do? What can we tell our children? What can our children do? Right. And I think in some ways, that is itself a sea change. I don't know if that is because people no longer have faith in government, or because sort of this problem has risen to a place where we really do want to take control. But I hope it doesn't sound silly, but how did we get here? We got here by making a lot of small missteps, very often for good reasons. And I think we're going to get out of it by making a lot of small correct steps, mm-hmm. right? Rather than sort of in one big swoosh. Yes. And I too think that the time is ripe to think of solutions, but also to think in very practical ways of what is the good life? People want a good life, right? The people want the pursuit of happiness, but I don't get any happiness out of spewing carbon. I get happiness out of being able to maybe go to a place and enjoy it, to go and meet people, to be able to spend life with those that I care about, right? And energy, I keep coming back to energy, becomes a source that allows me that pursuit of happiness. It's one of the sources. So it's not a question of, because some people asked, it's not a question of the finance world being good or bad. I think the finance world will want to make profit. And one of the exciting things happening is that where can you make profit right now includes and is increasingly being renewables. right? Coal, I have kind of stopped worrying about, except in this country, I was worrying about it, mostly because it is clearly a fading technology. Right? There are these new technologies that are cheaper. The world we are living in is a world where each one of us carries an energy source in our pocket. Right? This revolution has crept up on us without us knowing about it. Each one of us is now an energy producer, or at least carries a little generator. And not just in our phones, but in many, many ways. In some ways, I think we are moving back, because of climate and because of technology, to a world where our energy will come from multiple sources. Right? And what we can do in terms of things is make that transition happen in the right direction.
So,
Right?
so let's
Take small steps.
let's talk about a couple of threads that you just said. I'm sort of intrigued, and just a couple of points which I want to inject in our conversation. So I wrote this piece about a few weeks ago, which I knew was going to upset some people. And every once in a while I do that. I don't know why, but and it was about the fact that I think the right approach in public health is radical incrementalism. And what I meant by that was to have a radical idea, a radical vision, and to achieve it with incremental small steps. Now, that to me was echoed by what you just said. You said we're going to need a lot of these small steps to get us there. Now, what happened when I wrote the piece, which didn't surprise me, I said I expected it, is in this moment in time, a lot of people said, well, how could you not want a radical solution that changes things right now? And I simply do not think that that's intellectually honest. I actually do not think that complex systems change like that, because there are all sorts of structures and vested interests that are embedded, and changing radically is a dramatically different thing than having a radical vision for where you want to get to and change. So I just want to put that in our space. I'm actually curious what you think about that.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. I think I like this idea of incremental radicalism, but and maybe in climate it is happening, right? Maybe the way our young people are thinking is in fact changing that. But simply trying to solve climate or even public health, but certainly climate, as if it was an equation, that if we somehow figured out all the variables, we could find that one way to get the whole system in place, I don't think is going to work. It's going to be a lot of people doing a lot of good things. I am fascinated, by the way, by the questions that are coming, and I'm feeling bad we can't answer them. But Sandro, can I read one to you and see if you want to answer it or me? Because
Yes.
this one must not be left. This is Philip Weinstein asking, I want
saw
to
it.
buy a property in the Maldives Islands. Do
Yes,
you
yes, yes.
recommend?
Yeah, I saw.
And
So I actually, so first of all, that sounds wonderful. Lovely. I actually think the answer to that question, I'm actually delighted that you picked it up, is this conversation that we're having about what's your end, what are you trying to achieve? And fundamentally, I feel like one needs to choose how one wishes to live, and recognizing that there are risk sets involved in that, there are trade-offs involved in that. And if having a property in one of the Maldives is your particular expression of flourishing, happiness, the range of expression that you want to engage in, then I think it's reasonable to do so. There are risks involved, and of course there are projections about what climate change and water levels are going to do to the Maldives, and undoubtedly your insurance adjuster will take all those things into account. But to my mind, it's a very personal question. Sorry.
it is, but I do want. I'm hoping Philip's spirit is sort of forcing us to confront this practical question in a larger way. You grew up in an island. You know islands better than I do. I grew up in mountains, but I do know Maldives a bit. It's a beautiful place. So taking Sandro's cue, if the goal is to be able to enjoy this amazing beauty, then yes, go ahead and do it. Right? Because if that's the goal, if the goal is to buy it and and do something with it that will retain this amazing place, do that too. Maldives is an interesting place, and I wanted to use that cue because it is amazingly endangered. I was at a conference once with very senior government officials from Maldives, and over coffee, he mentioned, we lost an island yesterday. And I said, what do you mean you lost an island? He said, oh, it just went under. And I was sort of, aghast. It's like, if the US says one state just went under, there would be pandemonium, as there should be. So I was just totally sort of struck. And so I probed more, and I realized the reason he was nonchalant about it was this was a few rocks, if you will. But the reality he was pointing is that if you are in that real estate, sea level rise is a very real everyday weather condition. And you think about this in a very different way. So what they had lost was not a real island in which lots of people lived, and so on and so forth. But that is the reality that a lot of small island states face, right? Let me take this to the serious part. The serious part is Vanuatu, which is a Pacific island state, very small population, has an agreement with New Zealand that in the case of sea level rise and all of Vanuatu going under, New Zealand will take over the entire population of Vanuatu. They will be able to come and live there. Now, Vanuatu is tiny. The plane comes, population goes up. The plane leaves, the population goes down. I'm joking, but it is very small. Who is going to take over the 200 million people in Bangladesh? Right. This is the way to think. I'm not trying to scare, but this is where, for example, refugees becomes a climate issue. We are already seeing massive climatic movements because of loss of livelihoods. And that is where we need to sort of turn our thinking around and say, can we see the opportunity in this? Can we first of all halt these terrible things? There is a lot of serious thought on war and climate, because what do you think happens when resources come under pressure? That well that I was perfectly willing to share with you because there was plenty of water, suddenly I become a less welcoming neighbor.
Yeah, and I think you're putting in our space a couple of topics which have come up in the questions. One is migrants and migration, and population migration continues to increase, and more and more a lot of migration is influenced by these large-scale natural phenomena, and a lot of them by what are called disasters. I mean, natural disasters have been increasing over the past couple of decades, and I often say it in talks, and I say, if you think of disaster as an act of God, well, why would God all of a sudden be imposing more disasters? Well, of course, God is not. It's a simple combination of more global environmental climate change with urbanization. We're packing more people into cities that are more vulnerable to these climatic phenomena. That then results in more climate change. That results in more migration. That results in a lot of health consequences of migration, including, I just want to put it out there because we haven't discussed it, you and I, mental health, poor mental health, because we know that these stressors are associated with population mental health. I mean, we are seeing this right now globally in the context of COVID. We know that that's the case in the context of when you have migration. So these phenomena have enormous downstream consequences for all of health, for all the conditions that set the stage for people being able to live their life as we're discussing, to live their life and maximize their own happiness and flourish and thrive and achieve the kind of creative, cultural, intellectual expression that they want, or fundamentally, maybe they just want to watch Netflix, and that's okay as well. So these large-scale phenomena like global environmental climate change have global repercussions. And I was taken by Adil, your note about China and India, because I've often felt this way. I've often felt that when you look at the preponderance of where humans are on the planet, you cannot but come to the conclusion that the future is Asia. The future is Asia just by, it's a non-value statement. It is simply an observation of where the people are. And the future is good or bad, determined, not the least of which, by Asia. And so I often think that as a global research university of the scope and ambition of Boston University, it is critical that we have the kind of engagement with Asia intellectually, educationally, that allows us to be part of that conversation. I'm curious about your thoughts on that, given your deep roots in the region.
No, exactly. And, again, I see all these questions, and it is actually very interesting how many of these questions are about what we can do. Hans Batra asked that, and Larry Karp asked that, and lots of people asked that. And as I know we've been all over the place, but as we think about sort of this moment we are in, the moment of COVID, the moment of electoral change, the moment of climate change, there are some interesting signs, right? One of the things that happened with COVID, which was amazing, was how many things we thought were absolutely impossible happened how quickly. If I would have said to you, hey, Sandro, let's just say that we will ask Boston to half the people in Boston to stop driving tomorrow. Right? We would have been laughed out of wherever we were. And yet you get the news of this pathogen and it happens. Right? How many of us would have said, we're going to take classes online and people will just do it? Right? And yet when it happened so quickly. Right? The lesson I hope that we learn is that we don't really have to wait for a catastrophe to make the changes that we need to make. That a lot of the things that we say would be impossible are maybe not that impossible. But again, this goes to that human wisdom thing, that do we have it in us to do that before something disastrous happen? And I think the judgment on that is still out. My grandmother was a very wise woman. The empirical evidence, since you like graphs and charts, is the empirical evidence is that all grandmothers are wise. Grandfathers, we don't know. But mine used to say, point one finger, this is in many places, point one finger at someone and at least 3 point back at us. And what I take from these questions is that I do think a lot of it is about our individual action. And if I had a wish about individual action, it would be the ability in our students, in our colleagues, in our friends, myself, to link the local personal action with the global. Right? Let me say something that's not going to be very popular. On the one hand, this generation, the young people now, are more aware, more interested, more passionate about the climate than ever before. Right? And it's an honest passion. On the other hand, the same generation is turning out to be one of the most consumptive generations that we have seen in terms of raw consumption. If you measure it by simply the stream of Amazon packages that keeps getting dropped in your home. The sharing economy of not having a car is very good news. The fact that the actual amount traveled may not have actually decreased because it comes with the other part of the sharing economy, or sharing someone else's car, is still a disturbing trend. And that's what I was speaking to some young people the other day, and I very politely, humbly suggested to them that, activism is needed, but only if it leads to action. And I think that's where those tough questions we have to ask ourselves. That are we trading one type of behavior for another? It goes back to the China question in some ways. One of the questions in my field is, are China's emissions China's, or are they Walmart's? If I have sent all of my manufacturing off to Vietnam, and now I see my emissions going down and Vietnam's emissions going up, because the dirty part of manufacturing all these things that I am buying is now happening somewhere else. Where is that finger pointing in where the problem is and where the solution is? And I guess what I'm trying to say is, if there was one and only one thing that must be done, I think it relates to consumption. Without that, I do not see that there is a way out.
Yeah, I'll make my last comment, and then we can close out. And I want to pick up on when you said, Adil, we really need to be thoughtful and responsible about what we are trying to achieve. And I do feel like there is, the good news is these conversations about climate are happening more and more. They have become commonplace. And there's obviously argument, there's obviously challenges with those who understand and don't understand the science. But fundamentally, this conversation that we're having is not, it's not so unusual at this moment in time. But there is a disconnect between our radical vision and our commitment to the steps to actually to achieve that vision. And I do want to make sure that activism to the end of the radical vision also assumes the mantle of responsibility of the difficult work of change, painstakingly, incrementally going forward. And I do feel like we're at a moment of imbalance in that. I feel like we're at a moment of imbalance where we collectively, and I think it should be we collectively, are making a lot of noise or bringing a lot of heat, but not enough light. And I do think this should be a challenge to all of us, that we match our words with a commitment to the difficult steps of action that need to be taken to create a better world in the axe of climate change. I will stop there. Before I hand it over to you, Adil, I did want to make a note to thank Pamela Parker and Amanda Soros for their partnership in helping convene this event today, because I was meant to say it at the beginning and I forgot. I apologize. Adil, over to you for final words.
Thank you, Sandra, and thank you to everyone who did this. But thank you also to the everyone who's here and the wonderful conversation that's going on in the questions themselves. The one thing I feel bad about is not being able to get to so many of these great questions, and I hope you will continue. Everyone will continue this discussion, including with ourselves. You know, as I try to sort of think about sort of this potpourri of things that we've talked about, and I try to learn lessons about climate from other fields. I keep thinking of something you just said also about COVID, right? So what good could come out of a pandemic? Obviously not much. And I hope the vaccine comes. But even more than that, I hope the good that will come is what you were talking about, the realization that we do need a better healthcare system, that we do need to think about equity and justice in the healthcare system, that we do need to think about prevention. And I highlight that because those are exactly the things I would wish for in the climate change debate. Right? In a way, I go back to this thing, there is nothing that stops us from licking this problem. This is a doable problem. This should have been the problem that we averted. It is still a doable problem. I am enough of an optimist. You know, I go around wearing pink sweaters after all, right? I'm enough of an optimist to know that I don't think we're going to end with climate change. I think we will act. The question is when we will act. And if we delay it, there will be those who will fall off. Those on those coasts of Bangladesh. And I think that's the challenge before humanity, that, you know, can we actually think enough like a planet to be able to act in time, and in acting actually improve the state of the world, which I think we can, right? The amazing thing is that there is and will be there is happening a massive energy transformation for the positive, triggered by climate change. Now, can we make that energy transition equitable for those who actually need that energy the most? There is a absolute revolution happening in building technologies. The question is it only going to be these fancy buildings that you and I build here at Boston University, or can we make that big enough to be global? There is an absolute revolution that has happened in automobiles, right? The automobile that our parents drove, they cannot recognize the automobiles that are in the showrooms today, for whether it is for energy usage or whether it's for self-driving, whatever. The question is, can that actually help the challenges of those whose issue is not whether they have a car or not, but they live in slums and they have to travel large distances without infrastructure? So it comes back again and again to what you were saying. This is about prevention, and this is about equity. I think that's the challenge for humanism and humanity at this point.
I think
Thank you. Thank you
that's
so
a
much.
wonderful way to end. Thank you for this conversation, Andy. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.